How can one sin, like taking one bite from the forbidden fruit, separate man from God and consign man to an eternity in hell? Let me begin to answer it this way. If I were to hand you a bottle of pure drinking water, how many drops of arsenic would I need to put in it before you would say you wouldn't drink it because it's contaminated? I don't think you would say to me, oh, maybe 5 or 6 drops. I'm going to guess that even 1 drop would stop you from drinking it. The water had become contaminated and was no longer pure, even though you couldn't actually see the arsenic. When man was made in the image and likeness of God, they were both made holy and pure, just like God. 1 drop of sin would contaminate their holiness and purity and separate their spirit from God's spirit. This separation, or sin, brought immediate death to their spirit. Revelation chapter 21 describes the new heaven and the new earth, where all those who go to heaven will spend eternity with God. In verse 27, it says this, "But nothing unclean will ever enter into it, nor anyone who does what is detestable or false." Not only is heaven the dwelling place that God has chosen to make his presence known, but it is 100% pure and holy. Likewise, anyone allowed into heaven must be pure and must be holy. To help us understand what it means to be pure and holy, God has established a behavioral standard for entrance into heaven which will require anyone who will enter to be pure and holy. This standard is referred to in the Bible as God's law, the law of God, or simply the law. You may know it as the 10 Commandments. What you may not know is that the 10 Commandments and all subsequent moral rules and regulations for purity and holiness given by God in the Bible are based on 2 great commandments that Jesus explains to a crowd of Pharisees and lawyers in Matthew chapter 22, verses 35 to 40. It says this, "And one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. 'Teacher, which is the great commandment of the law?' And he said to him, 'You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 commandments depend all the law and the prophets.'" To love God with all your heart, soul, and mind means to worship, obey, and acknowledge God every minute of your life, in what you love, how you think, what you do. And to love your neighbor means to even love everyone, including your enemies. This is an absolutely impossible thing for us to do in our current condition, and God knows this. This is why the Bible tells us in Romans chapter 3, verse 10, "As it is written, there is none righteous, not even one." No one is perfect enough to meet God's standard. And then in verse 23, it says, "For all have sinned and come short or fall short of the glory of God." We all, every one of us, falls short of the purity and the holiness of God, which the law requires for entrance into his presence in heaven. Since all other laws, rules, and regulations God has established as the standard for behavior, for holiness, righteousness, and purity to get into heaven, are all based on the first one, to violate any one of them is a violation of the first. The failure to meet the standards of even one statute of the law, rule, or moral behavior or regulation for righteousness demonstrates a person's impurity and disqualifies them for entrance to the dwelling place of God. The Bible is very clear that you only need to violate one to have violated the whole thing. James chapter 3, verse 10 says this, "For whosoever keeps the whole law but fails in one point has become guilty of all." But just one sin? That just doesn't seem fair, and I get it. But this isn't about being fair, it's about justice. You know, there are a lot of different conditions in prison, and some people have it easier than others, and it's based upon the punishment for their crime. But one thing is absolutely certain. They are all in prison. They are there because they are lawbreakers, and you only have to break one law to be a lawbreaker. I hope this illustration about bees and allergies might help you a little bit to understand this. Imagine that you are severely allergic to bee stings. Even though there are many bees in the beehive, you would only need to be stung by one nasty bee to be in grave, life-threatening danger. You wouldn't need to be stung by the whole beehive. Like the beehive, God's law has many parts, but altogether, all they are considered God's law. You only need to fail at one to have broken the law. If you were stung, your situation would become desperate very quickly, and the doctor would need to give you a powerful antidote very fast. Likewise, because of our sin condition, we are all in a desperate situation and in great need for a spiritual antidote. Now, we've already seen that everyone sins. Nobody is perfect. Now let's take a quick look at the penalty or the price for that sin. In Romans chapter 6, verse 23, the Bible tells us what the payment for sin is. It says this, "For the wages of sin is death, not just physical death, but also spiritual death, which now is eternal death, because your spirit is eternal." We all die physically, but remember from our lesson 1, you have a never-dying soul. So death of your physical body does not mean that you as a living soul cease to exist. Since your soul will go on to live for eternity somewhere, to be separated from eternal life with God is to be condemned to eternal life without God or away from God. Eternal death doesn't mean non-existence. It means to be separated from God, and that means separated from where God is, which is in heaven. Hebrews chapter 9, verse 27 tells us what happens to the soul who dies without his or her sins being forgiven. It says, "It is appointed for man once to die, and then after that comes the judgment." The judgment is the condemnation for being guilty of sin and the sentencing to eternal separation from God in hell. In Mark chapter 9, verse 48, Jesus describes hell as where the worm, which is the maggot, does not die and the fire is not quenched. Jesus was undoubtedly using a description of the valley that is just south of Jerusalem as an example of hell. The valley is where all the trash was dumped and it was kept burning day and night, and you could see the smoke from it for miles. The maggots would die, as would be usual, but he's describing hell as a place where even the maggots don't even die. In Luke chapter 13, verse 28, Jesus also describes hell as that place where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And then in Matthew 8:12 and 22:13 and 25:30, Jesus describes it as outer darkness. To be with God is to be in never-ending light. To be in outer darkness, then, is to be as far away from that light as is possible. And since God is in heaven, to be as far away from God, then, as possible means to be in hell. However, that doesn't mean that hell is out of God's reach, and Satan could just run things the way that he wants to. It means that the mercy and grace of God that display all his loving attributes will not exist. Only judgment and wrath with all his just attributes will exist. Revelation chapter 20, verses 11 to 15, describes the final judgment of everyone who has ever lived. It refers to a book of life. It says, "And if anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire." This book is titled the Lamb's Book of Life in Revelation 21:27. The Lamb, of course, is referring to Jesus. So now we have seen that we all sin, that none of us is holy and pure enough to be allowed into heaven. We all die physically, which then means if nothing changes, when we die, we will all face the judgment of eternal separation from God in hell. Then the bottom line question is, how do I get my name written in Jesus' book of life before I die?